Hello, everyone. This particular episode is directed particularly at the right-leaning conservative element of my audience. However, the left-leaning part of my audience will also find it useful. I want to talk specifically about the efforts of communists to undermine and demoralize the United States, and the part of this story that is not spoken enough about. A lot of effort is justifiably being made to call out the efforts in academia to radicalize people into far-left communist beliefs. However, this is only part of the equation. First, let me share with you a clip of Yuri Bezmenov, the Soviet defector who came to the United States to warn us of communist efforts to undermine our nation's sense of identity, demoralize and destabilize our society as part of an effort to eventually destroy the United States using methods the Soviets had used in other countries. This clip is part of a much larger presentation that I will be going into more depth about later. However, conservatives in particular need to consider the presence of bad actors within the United States who are unwittingly helping this process of demoralization. Let's take a look.
If we are talking about capitalists or wealthy businessmen, I think they are selling the rope on which they will hang very soon. If they don't stop, if they cannot curb their unsettled desire for profit, and if they keep on trading with the monster of the Soviet communism, they are going to hang very soon. And they will pray to be killed, but unfortunately they will be sent to Alaska probably to manage industry of slaves. It's simplistic. I know it sounds unpleasant. I know Americans don't like to listen to things which are unpleasant. But I have defected not to tell you the stories about such idiocy as microfilm, James Bond type espionage. This is garbage. You don't need any espionage anymore. I have come to talk about survival. It's a question of survival of this system.
So let's consider for a moment what he is talking about. Conservatives are correct to heed Yuri's warnings about communist efforts to undermine our system. But the group that Yuri is calling out here plays a major role in the plans of the communists. Note, obviously at this point we would swap out Soviet Russia for communist China so far as who is the likely culprit when it comes to manipulating the situation. But now we are going to talk about the role that the super wealthy play in this situation. As Yuri pointed out, the wealthy are selling the rope they will be hung with. Our economy has largely been sold to communist China. They continue to grow stronger while we grow weaker. One of the things the early part of the pandemic showed us was our dependence on China for much of our manufacturing. But what Yuri specifically is talking about is the obsession with profits from the top 1%, the same group that the Occupy Wall Street movement was trying to draw attention to. Now, a lot of efforts are put into telling conservatives to blame these people, or maybe these people, with our current economic situation. Basically, a lot of emphasis is placed on addressing the entitlements in our system and that how apparently the real leeches on our economy are the super poor. But you will notice that very little, if any, attention is given to these people and their role specifically in undermining our economic situation and creating a situation where capitalism doesn't work for everybody. And this is just one aspect of it. I'm going to get into more of it later. But Walmart specifically did a lot to destroy the middle class. And we look at the cheap stuff that we're buying and we think to ourselves, this is great. This is capitalism working. Our prices are going down. But in order to get those prices, they created a situation where we've shut down our manufacturing and we're outsourcing it to places where people basically live not much better than plantation slaves in many cases to make our goods, something that people in the United States are not willing to do for obvious reasons that people who are in those countries can be forced to do through poverty. So this chart shows the U.S. jobs displaced by the growing goods trade deficit with China since 2001 in thousands of jobs. Where does this trade deficit come from? Well, basically, we have closed down our manufacturing and we've moved it to China and places like China, and the jobs go with them. And this creates lower prices in places like Walmart, but it also destroys the local middle class because they can't find good paying jobs anymore, and if they own their own businesses, their businesses are undermined. Now, whose fault is this? This obviously isn't something that the welfare people are putting together. This is something that the corporate welfare people are putting together. The top 1% play a huge role in this situation that is often ignored. Now, some efforts are, pushed by the conservative media to get you to blame these people. And these are the people who work in the sweatshops overseas, the places where our jobs went. Many of them live in circumstances that are not really that different than the plantation slaves that we used to have in the United States. But again, nobody's talking about who sent the jobs over there, and their role in the situation. Now, organized labor in the United States did an awful lot to prevent circumstances like this from existing within the United States. And that used to be enough. But now, due to advents in shipping technology, you can make your entire workforce in manufacturing look much like this and take them out of situations where they live like this. The super wealthy want situations where they have their boot on your throat, because that puts them in a circumstance of maximized profits, maximized power over you, the worker. Now this chart shows where the jobs are going. US-based multinational companies added jobs overseas during the 2000s and cut them at home. Cumulative change since 1999. As you can see, the up is all on the side of jobs outside the US. The down is on the side of jobs, in the US. And this trend just continued. It was facilitated by changes in our economic structure in the United States and in our laws that were put together in a bipartisan fashion. More on that later. Here's another graph that shows the effects of outsourcing on our economy. As you can see, it hurts American workers a hell of a lot more than it helps them in most of the categories presented. Now, another culprit that is frequently brought up when it comes to the issues of our economy and people leeching off of it, and specifically about why we may have difficulty finding a job in circumstances of economic difficulty, would be the illegal immigrants, or the undocumented workers, as the left has been manipulated to call them. And a lot of effort is put on to suggesting the solutions to this would basically just make it harder for illegal immigrants to get into the country, put up a wall, etc., etc. But have you ever noticed that the root cause of this situation never receives any kind of attention on the part of the right-wing media? And who are they? Why is it that nobody ever talks about the employers of illegal immigrants? Why is no attention ever given to their role in the situation? Why are there never any, Fox News pundits or whatever calling for this problem to be addressed? And I think the answer to the question has to do with the fact that your media, both right and left, is owned by corporations, and that they're more interested in getting the middle class to blame the poor, whether it's immigrants, or welfare moms, for all of their problems. And that's the reason why, as you can see, criminal prosecutions against employers are rare. The overall data shows that criminal prosecutions of employers who knowingly hire undocumented workers are rare, and most that are convicted receive little more than token punishment. So why is this? Why isn't this aspect of it ever addressed? Why are we just talking about building walls and increasing border control, which I'm not saying, could not be a solution if this is what you think is the problem with the economy, but wouldn't it be easier to simply prosecute the people that are doing it over here? It would be easier, but it wouldn't be convenient for the people who actually own your government, and that would be those top 1% types I was talking about earlier. Consider for a moment the game here that they are playing. Again, you are being told as the middle-class conservatives that all of your problems would go away if we just dealt with anybody other than the 1% who created those problems. Now, if you have been conditioned into traditional thinking so far as politics, you will find yourself trying to rationalize a way as to how the situation was obviously created by the other tribe. The truth is, this situation was orchestrated with efforts from both of the major political parties, and this truth exposes a reality that people often don't consider. That truth is that there really is only one party. The party that Yuri was mentioning is playing a major role in helping the communists undermine our economy and our way of life. the super wealthy. It was both Reaganomics and Nafta that brought us to the situation that we are currently in, that is making capitalism only work for some people in this country. Now, honest capitalists will admit that this is an issue. Free market capitalists will say that this is a perfect reason to simply remove government intervention, as the system that is supposed to protect us from white-collar crime is clearly corrupt. This, to me, comes off as basically the conservative version of abolish the police. Basically, it is naive to assume that because some cops are corrupt that we don't need cops. It is equally naive to assume that because some government regulators are corrupt, we should do away with government agencies that seek to protect the people and simply rely on the goodwill of wealthy people to not behave immorally. So let's take a moment to reflect on the history of the situation and how both sides contributed to the circumstances that we are in right now. Reaganomics, a historical watershed. The socio-economic impact of Reaganomics and its long-run deleterious legacy is documented. The preponderance of data indicate that economic growth was not particularly impressive in the wake of the tax cuts of 1981 or 1986. GDP did snap back to potential, but failed to accelerate beyond the rates achieved in prior or subsequent decades. The supposed incentives of supply-side economics failed to materialize. People did not work more, they did not save or invest more than they did before, and the benefits trickled down like molasses and got stuck at the very top of the income distribution. Instead, Reagan's presidency was a watershed in the U.S. economic development in the sense that it reversed many of the accomplishments of the New Deal and inaugurated an era in which low-skilled men's wages began a long period of decline and labor's share of GDP continued to fall. Reagan's true legacy is a dual economy that accompanied the hollowing out of the middle class, a more business-friendly regulatory and oversight framework for Wall Street that ultimately led to the financial crisis, a stupendous increase in the national debt from 30% to 50% of the GDP that put it on a path such that by 2012 it exceeded 100%. Anti-statism that contributed to the rise of Trumpism, a remarkable rise in inequality that gave rise to an oligarchy, and the benign neglect of blue-collar workers who eventually became Hillary Clinton's deplorables. Reagan put the economy on a trajectory to ultimately, even if not inevitably, led to the triumph of Trumpism and an economy of malaise. Now, to those of you who are my followers who obviously are Trumpers, don't take too much offense to what this person is pointing out. They are more or less pointing out that it was Reagan's contributions to our economic system that led to the situation that pissed you guys off that made you want to vote for Trump in the first place, because Donald Trump made a lot of promises about how he was going to fix our economy. Now, whether or not he did is a discussion for a different time. The point is that what created the circumstances that led to Donald Trump being appealing was basically a bipartisan effort. So they're pretty hard on Reagan here, but again, it wasn't just him. Bill Clinton signed Nafta into law, so let's talk about that. The North American Free Trade Agreement was the door through which American workers were shoved into the neoliberal global labor market. By establishing the principle that U.S. corporations could relocate production elsewhere and sell back into the United States, Nafta undercut the bargaining power of American workers, which had driven the expansion of the middle class since the end of World War II. The result has been 20 years of stagnant wages and the upward redistribution of income, wealth, and political power. Nafta affected U.S. workers in four principal ways. First, it caused the loss of some 700,000 jobs as production moved to Mexico. Most of these losses came in California, Texas, and Michigan, and other states where manufacturing is concentrated. To be sure, there were some job gains along the border in service and retail sectors resulting from the increased trucking activity, but these gains are small in relation to the losses and are in lower-paying occupations. The mass majority of workers who lost jobs from Nafta suffered a permanent loss of income. Secondly, Nafta strengthened the ability of U.S. employers to force workers to accept lower wages and benefits. As soon as Nafta became law, corporate managers began telling their workers that their companies intended to move to Mexico unless the workers lowered the cost of their labor. In the midst of collective bargaining negotiations with unions, some companies would even start loading machinery into trucks that they said was bound for Mexico. The same threats were used to fight union organizing efforts. The message was, if you vote in a union, we will move south of the border. With Nafta, corporations also could more easily blackmail local governments into giving them tax reductions and other subsidies. Third, the destructive effect of NAFTA on the Mexican agricultural and small business sectors dislocated several million Mexican workers and their families and was a major cause in the dramatic increase in undocumented workers flowing into the U.S. labor market. This put further downward pressure on U.S. wages, especially in the already lower paying market for less skilled labor. Fourth, and ultimately most important, NAFTA was the template for rules of the emerging global economy, in which the benefits would flow to capital and the cost to labor. The U.S. governing class, in alliance with the financial elites of its trading partners, that would be the people Yuri was talking about, applied NAFTA's principles to the World Trade Organization, to the policies of the World Bank and IMF, and to the deal under which employers of China's huge supply of low-wage workers were allowed to access U.S. markets in exchange for allowing American multinational corporations the right to invest there. Here we have China, once again, the extremely wealthy, purchasing the rope they will be hung with because they're selling our economy to China. Despite the rhetoric, the central goal of NAFTA was not expanding trade. After all, the U.S., Mexico, and Canada had been trading goods and services with each other for 3 centuries. NAFTA's central purpose was to free American corporations from U.S. laws protecting workers and the environment. Moreover, it paved the way for the rest of the neoliberal agenda in the U.S., the privatization of public services, the regulation of finance, and the destruction of the independent trade union movement. The inevitable result was to undercut workers' living standards all across North America. Wages and benefits have fallen behind worker productivity in all 3 countries. Moreover, despite declining wages in the United States, the gap between the typical American and the typical Mexican worker in manufacturing remains the same. Even after adjusting for differences in living costs, Mexican workers continue to make about 30% of the wages of workers in the United States. Thus, NAFTA is both symbol and substance of the global race to the bottom. So, the end result of both NAFTA and Reaganomics working together is the situation that you see here. These circumstances, these economic circumstances, are the reason that both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders were popular. They're also the reason why the system did everything they could to sabotage both of them. And also, as I pointed out in my previous video, because the left has their own problems with this, the reason why social justice matters are being pushed to the forefront as far as what should be your focus if you're an American citizen, instead of any attention being given to this situation. And in that video, which I guess I'll share in the cards at the end of this one, I pointed out that Hillary Clinton, for example, when addressing a crowd, specifically trying to turn them against Bernie Sanders, said, "We could break up the big banks tomorrow, but what would that do to, gay rights, and how would that help black people, and et cetera, et cetera?" It was all a distraction, for the left. And the right has just always been consistently distracted by, being told that their real problem is the poor. So, if you're, let's say, in the second column over here, maybe the 22%, or even the third column, which is, the 7%, you're being told that all of your economic woes are created by the column on the far left. When the truth is, the column on the far right, which is the 0.7%, are the reasons for all of these issues. They pushed for these economic policies. They are the ones that are destroying capitalism in the United States and making it unfunctional. So even if you're pro-capitalist, something has to be done about this. And you need to wake up to the fact that you are being manipulated to believe that your problem is the people on the left, figuratively, and directly. And there are people who are on the left who are a problem. I spent a hell of a lot of time on this channel pointing that out. There's no question. And again, I'm not trying to convert you. You can have whatever political ideology you want. But even if you're a capitalist, this is not sustainable. This situation is exactly what Yuri was warning about. If you become so obsessed with profits that you make the rules of capitalism so broken, people are going to want to play a different game. If you want a more modern example of this, you can just look at the fact that for some reason those people on the far right of the column I just showed you are, 283 billion richer during the coronavirus pandemic. And, how exactly did that come about? Well, There was a lot of policies that were put in place to choke small businesses to death. And you can blame that on Democrats, I guess, but the truth is that's also a bipartisan effort. As I brought up in one of my previous videos, the response to the coronavirus came in two forms. On the left, they had this, 2 weeks of paid sick leave that would only have to be paid by the employers with 500 or less employees. So that was the small print part of it, but that was what the Democrat-controlled Congress at the time had put forth for coronavirus relief, which of course was only going to hurt small businesses and did not in any way harm anybody in that column on the far right. It did not harm any of the people that Yuri was talking about, the people who are so concerned about profits to the point that they don't even care about the long-term consequences of what it is that they're doing. But on the other side of that, the Republican-controlled Senate, all they offered was some relief checks that were going to go out and were going to be tax reduced in such a way that by the time they were done, the people who needed the most were going to get the least amount of money. And the wealthy people weren't going to get very much either. That's, meaning wealthy as in middle class. So there was really a bipartisan effort to ignore the people in that situation and only to uphold, again, Yuri's little group of capitalists. They were the only ones who did any better during the course of the pandemic. And once again, we're being distracted. We're being divided on this issue. We're not talking about the fact that the wealthy got 283 billion richer. We're talking about mask mandates or vaccine mandates. We're talking about, well, you're getting all that unemployment or what, that's what's basically being held to blame on all of this. And that's all a distraction. So in conclusion, thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation, particularly if you were on the right and conservative. My objective was not and is not to try and change your political affiliations. My objective is to point out that both the people who give a damn about other people on the left and the people who give a damn about other people on the right have a common enemy. And if you are really concerned about a communist invasion, then we have to address this enemy in their role in creating an environment that is vulnerable to the infiltration of communist ideology. Yuri was warning us that the super wealthy are selling the rope they will be hung with. We as Americans of both the left and the right need to take action to be sure that we are not swinging from the gallows with them. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. If you like my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I now only need 80 patrons total at $10 a month to get to my goal, which would allow me to continue to do this kind of work with the research and the guests and all of that you guys have come to love. Again, if I can't meet this goal, I'm not going to stop, but it would make it much more difficult for me to give you the same quality and frequency that you're used to here on V Radio. Thanks again for tuning in.